Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and owner of 3 ponies. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing 3 easy keepers on multiple acres of Iowa pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and we've been collaborating on this podcast for the past year. And like most good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We're always talking about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy the following episode.
I was in Kansas City, Missouri, speaking at the International Hoof Summit, and I met hoof care professionals from all over the world. I was introduced to a large number of interesting products as well, from hoof care to supplements to dressings and all kinds of special shoes you can't even imagine, and 3D printed pads as well. That seems to be a fun new thing, at least to me, 3D printed hoof care pads. We'd already been planning an episode on winter hoof care, and with the recent weather and being surrounded by so much hoof care knowledge, it really got me thinking about some of the unique challenges winter poses for our horses, from fetlock deep mud to icy frozen ground. I'm excited that we're being joined today by Dr. Sammy Pittman. Dr. Pittman is a renowned farrier and veterinarian and an expert in the field of equine podiatry, and his practice is Innovated Equine Podiatry, located in Collinsville, Texas. Dr. Pittman, welcome to Scoop and Scale.
Thanks for having me.
So we'd already invited you to be on this podcast before the International Hoof Summit last week, but I was standing in a booth with a friend of mine, and we got talking about you having spoken at a meeting last year that she had been at. And I mentioned that you were coming on this podcast, and she said, he's standing right over there in that booth. And so it was great to actually get to meet you in person. That was kind of a treat. I wasn't expecting that.
It's a pretty small world when it's all, when you really consider it all. So it's not uncommon that lots of people are in that room that we were in.
Yeah, no, there were some very fascinating people at that summit. And your booth was fascinating because there were all kinds of preserved legs and hoof specimens that are so helpful for educating horse owners about the anatomy and pathology of their horses' lower limbs when they're having issues. I've certainly used them in college teaching and pony club and all kinds of things. And you also had talking about 3D printing, you had a 3D printer making something in the corner of the booth. I'm not sure what you were making, but I know you as a veterinary podiatrist, so I think we should perhaps start off with having you explain what it is exactly you do, because you apparently wear a lot of hats.
I do. It started out as a farrier from the standpoint of I grew up on a ranching type scenario where we just learned to shoot horses at a very remedial level. Always wanted to go to veterinary school, so did go to veterinary school. Actually, went out into mixed animal practice out of veterinary school, and met my mentor, a guy named Rick Redden, about within the first year that I graduated. And he had a whole lot of really good mechanical information and laminitis therapies that just had a lot of answers to the questions that I had, and that kind of re-sparked this idea of having a veterinary farrier career. So, basically being able to combine the physiology and pharmacokinetics and pharmacology and the understanding of anatomy and disease processes with the mechanical side and application of putting on shoes and mechanical devices that can help blood supply and change loads around is basically what the whole job centers around. So a big part of what I'm teaching and speaking to is mechanics are my medicine. So yes, I'm able to diagnose and image the problem, but also figure out, how can we change the loads in that foot to improve blood supply and improve health and get the foot growing better. So the other things like the preserved legs. So that's a company that we purchased a few years back with some partners. It was a lady named Allie Hayes had that business for the last probably 30 something years and was looking at retiring. And we all, myself and the two other partners, have a lot of her models and always like buying them. And we're obviously big fans of pathology and anatomy. So it was something that we didn't want to see go away. So we chipped in and try to run it all together. And then the other company that I have is basically a retail company that manages all of the things that I design and sell. So shoes, tools, the 3D printer thing that you saw. I've gotten into 3D modeling and learning how to make things that I need and then be able to print them out. So it's been
that's cool.
It's been a pretty helpful thing. So I think at that show particularly, I was printing out some little miniature horse rocker clogs for a laminitis case. So
wow, fun.
It's really fun to be able to think of something, create it in a 3D model form, design it specifically for a case, and then go push a button and it appears after a few hours.
So can you make things that are like super custom fit then to a specific horse?
You can, yes. Basically, if you have the measurements or tracings or whatever, then yeah, you could make essentially a custom fit shoe pad, whatever you would like. Thankfully, in the horse world, we can make some general sizes and then have those on the shelf and ready to be, custom fit and modified. But I would say most of the 3D printed horse stuff that I use, I have some generic shapes and sizes that I would go ahead and have ready. That way I don't have to go wait for the printer to make something for a few hours. Some of those things can take a while to print. But if I have a case that, hey, I'm going to have to build something for it, I'll go ahead and take measurements and design what I want and have it ready for the next appointment.
Nice. And for our listeners who maybe are not familiar with the cadaver legs, what I thought was really brilliant about some of the cadaver legs you had, and I don't think I've actually seen this version before, is you would have a horse's lower limb split in half, like front to back, and then it was actually one half of like two different horses, right? So you had one half that had maybe founded, and then the other half of the limb was actually, good and normal and showed, sort of normal how it should be versus the pathologic founded horse on the other side. And that was, I think, really interesting. And I bet that's a really useful teaching tool when you're working with your clients to be able to show them this is the reality of what's going on in that laminitic horse's leg versus what it should look like.
Correct. That's probably one of our most popular models because you're going to get one normal side of a foot that's freeze dried and preserved, and then the other side hinged to it is a foundered foot. So it's really helpful. Farriers, veterinarians all like to have that because it really shows both aspects very easily, so that owners are more aware of what we're dealing with.
And I was just saying that actually before we started recording. I think that most horse owners know the word laminitis, and we all talk about laminitis, but to actually see it up close, for a vet or a farrier to have that, to be able to see the normal one and then one that's actually got the rotation. I think that's really powerful for people to see, and hopefully helps people realize that they don't want it.
Exactly. That everything kind of gets grouped into as this laminitis category. And, a lot of these, is there some inflammation of the lamina? But I think where even as veterinarians and farriers, we fail to recognize that the major problem that we're having to deal with is the structural failure of the lamina doing its job. So yes, there's inflammation of the lamina, and we all kind of just toss everything in that laminitis category. But like some of these metabolic horses, I don't think there's a whole lot of actual inflamed lamina. They're just faulty, and then they're allowing that bone to settle into the solar corium. So I think a lot of what we're dealing with is a solar coriumitis, where the bone is setting heavily into the sole and creating blood supply compression and pain from that. So it's, I tell my clients, is like, we want to think about this from a standpoint of like a broken bone. a broken bone. Is there inflammation of the bone? Is there inflammation of soft tissue? Yes, but we have a structural component that has failed that we need to stabilize and in an effort to get it to heal appropriately. So that's where, like my job and farriers' jobs become so important is how we mechanically shift loads away from that damaged area as that structure can heal itself as we move along is one of the most highest priorities of treating these cases.
So what type of cases do you normally see in your practice? Like, are they typically referrals from vets of complex hoof cases?
Yeah, yes. So it's a broad range. I would say, as a general rule, we get the toughest of the tough cases. So we have a lot of really good veterinarians here in my area, and a lot of times they're doing the initial work, and the cases that with their typical protocol that's not working, they're like, hey, this one's not going our way, then we're gonna punt this one over to Dr. Pittman. So I'm usually getting some of the tougher cases for the most part, especially from a founder situation. There are a few people that are eager to get the best they can get from the word go. So even if simple, mild, thin soles or lamenesses that are just not off the scale, but yet are troublesome and their regular veterinary farrier teams are just not getting there. So I've got a few cases that are, that are not very complex. Those are fun because you get to see really quick responses without all the crazy things that we have to do. But a lot of referrals from word of mouth from owners, veterinarians in the local area. A lot of farriers will. They're glad to have somebody to say, "Hey, this is above my head. This is above my pay grade, and I think you'd be better suited to go let somebody else look at it." So,
well, winter poses unique challenges for hoof health in horses, and a lot of horses, if they're in turnout, they're faced with standing in mud or snow, sometimes ice. How do these conditions affect hoof health and integrity?
I think a big portion of hoof health is, especially horses standing in mud and snow and ice, is that they're in a constant state of moisture. So wet conditions or moisture is an absolute havoc on the hoof wall. And I tell my clients is like, if you were to take the studs in your house, the 2x4s, and just soak them with water every day and expect them to bear weight, at some point that wood is going to bend because it's got too much moisture, and it's more flexible. And the hoof wall is very similar. It gets more bendable and more flexible the more moist it is. Also, the sole will tend to soften and exfoliate easier. So if they're going over rough terrain, then that sole is going to come off easier. I think so. I lived a couple of years in Alaska, and they talked about how it was really dry up there, but yet those horses are always standing in moisture. In the summertime, it's a swamp. In the wintertime, it's snow. So there's just always moisture around that. So I think that the moisture content reduces the structural integrity of the wall.
When I think of horses in wet conditions and standing in mud, like I think of thrush. Could you explain what thrush is and what causes that?
Pretty basic. Thrush is basically definitely a bacterial component that's going to eat away at the keratin structure that's on the outside of the frog. I think that to some degree there's a symbiotic relationship between the horse and the bacteria that we deem as thrush. So, that sounds funny, but if you go to a very dry, arid environment of Arizona or out west, then they don't really have thrush per se, and the foot doesn't exfoliate that well, and you have to really torch the foot to get it to exfoliate. You got to knife a lot of it out. You have to get rid of a lot of foot. Where if you go to a wet environment, it's the opposite. In a wet environment, the environment is in the favor of the bacteria and thrush that they live and step in every day, and that bacteria eats away at the horn and eats away too much. So then you end up with an environment that is more designed for the bacteria, so it wins the battle and takes away too much foot, and you get more bacterial eating away at the keratin and the frog, and it sets up, and it can get as far as even into the sensitive tissue. Where the opposite, where the dry environment is probably more in favor of the horse, and there's not any real thrush bacteria to help eat away some of that. So somewhere in the middle is probably happy. I think realistically, those bacteria that are involved in thrush, they live in it every day. It's in their ground, it's in the soil, it's in their manure. So as they step into it, if it stays there and if it stays moist and wet, then that's where it favors the bacteria more and not the horse. And that's where you can get problems with deeper infections that become more painful because they get closer to the sensitive structures.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether, sort of being in an environment that has a lot of wet, sort of rotting organic matter is almost worse than just kind of good, clean mud. And what makes me think of that is that growing up in England, where the horses are out all day in fetlock deep mud, our personal horses really never dealt with thrush. And when I was little, like my mom was we bedded on straw, and she was a pretty big believer in, like, you don't pick the feet out when they come in from the field. You just leave the mud in their feet. It'll dry in their feet overnight. We used to pull out these lovely casts of mud and straw out of their feet the next morning. Others in the same facility, their horses did struggle with thrush and they picked their feet out every night. And her philosophy was that the good clean mud was better in their feet than being in the barn and standing in manure and urine soaked straw and what have you, that might be worse. And I just wonder whether that sort of rotting organic matter is an issue, because it's certainly, I've lived in places where people will throw their damp shavings out into the run-ins on the back of the stalls to try and kind of make the run-ins less muddy. And then they're out sort of standing in mud with decomposing shavings and what have you. And I just think, that seems like a really pretty nasty environment to have your hooves in versus, good, clean mud, if there is such a thing. So do you think that's worse, kind of being in that sort of rotting organic matter type environment?
I would definitely agree that those types of situations, you have a higher rate of thrush and rotting away the frog for sure. I would agree a lot as well, because here at my place in North Texas, we have a lot of we call it just black dirt. It's really good for farming. It's not really good for horses as far as footing goes. And it's a real sticky black dirt. Now we can go just a mile away from my property and it turns into sand, but right here where we're at is a lot of black dirt. And I've always worried about it with my horses, but I'll go out there to my horses that unfortunately don't get that much hair, and you can pick out a nice formed piece of this black mud that's stuck in their foot, and it is pristine underneath.
Right.
There won't be any thrush. It'll be just perfectly clean. So I think two parts. I mean, it seals up a little bit from the outside world. I always get worried they're going to get too moist, and actually, when I pop that out of there, it'll be pretty dry underneath and nice and clean. So I would definitely agree that the environment that they're in, the decomposed material, or and even different types of mud and dirt that they're in, probably has a lot to do with it for sure.
That makes sense.
Your mom was smart.
I think you're right. That mineral composition of your soils is so different in different geographies too, right? Thinking about your black dirt. And I just see that, you see these photographs of horses standing around round bale feeders or just round bales, not even in feeders, and just standing on 50% of their hay. And they just stand there all day, on the hay, manuring on the hay. And you just think, okay, it's sort of dry-ish, but not really. It's pretty damp. And I don't know. I just think that doesn't seem like a great, it's a waste of hay and your feed bill. And second, it doesn't seem like it's probably a great choice for hoof health either. So
I think it definitely goes back to, obviously, if you were to do some sort of, if you were to do bacterial cultures of that soil that's standing around a hay bale versus just out in the pasture, you're definitely going to get a difference of bacterial colonization type of species that are there for sure. So
yeah, I left the Hoof Summit with so many free samples of different things, most of them for treating thrush. Some of them had copper in them, some had tea tree oil in them, some didn't have tea tree oil in them because they claimed that if your dog ate the hoof clippings with tea tree oil on it, it might really hurt your dog. There were gels, powders, all kinds of different things. I've certainly been told by some companies, to avoid things like copper sulfate because it's caustic and that it might not be good for, it's going to kill off your bacteria and what have you, but it's also going to be caustic to any new tissue that's growing. So how do we treat thrush if we are unlucky enough to have a horse with it? And, are there ingredients that we should be avoiding? What are your recommendations?
Well, I think the biggest key is environment. So if that horse is in that environment where they're standing in deep, wet muck and mire, then that's going to be the primary goal, is to try to change the environment and reduce the moisture. Secondly, it's going to depend on how invasive is the thrush at the point that you notice it. So if you're really late in the game and you've got a lot of thrush and you can pick at it just a little bit and it easily bleeds and you're down to that live frog corium, then you don't want to use anything caustic. So copper sulfate, some of the things like Durasol that have formaldehyde in it. I don't want to use anything that's potentially going to burn live tissue. In those cases, usually for the first week to 10 days, then I will use something like betadine or chlorhexidine, something that's tissue safe and not going to create any direct burn. Just kill that out, get it dried up. And then once you have some cornification and horns start to cover that tissue, then copper sulfate and all these other things that we commonly use that are caustic can be very helpful to toughen that horn up. But I want to make sure that I got several millimeters of hard protective horn or frog tissue over that before I'm using anything that's going to be caustic. Copper sulfate is wonderful. I do use a lot of Durasol in my everyday horses that before I'm putting a pad on, I will treat any areas that are suspicious with Durasol. I think, again, formaldehyde, it's a real dilute formaldehyde plus some Genetian violet. It's going to kill anything that's in there. So as long as they're not, as long as we're not getting into the sensitive tissue, I think that's a safe approach. And then I have a product that I developed, which is basically clay. I mean, I come up with the idea after seeing some other products, but also watching my own horses that have mud stuck in their feet and are pretty clean. That type of clay that has some copper sulfate mixed in it, some eucalyptus oil, some raw manuka honey, and some zinc oxide. So I'll smear that in there and pack it. I've got a few farms that some gypsy horse owners that have really struggled with some thrush and their horses that live in the stalls, and they'll just keep that packed in there, and it really seems to be helpful. I think copper sulfate is a very advantageous chemical, but again, I wouldn't want to put it on any live tissue.
So I am all about it. Jill and I, eyes lit up. I was looking at her face when you said about clay. We've both used clay products in our horses' feet. And honestly, I use it like when I'm traveling, like last week when I was traveling for work and I know my horse's feet, I'm going to get picked out for a few days because I'm going to be gone. I will pack their feet, or at least down either side of the frog and down the cleft of the frog, with clay that's specifically for feet. And it's great. I mean, it stays in there. I come back 4 days later, pick their feet out, and you can still find small amounts of clay left in there. And it seems to really be good for the feet. And Jill, I know you've used it, and you've got a completely different climate than me and had good luck as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pony that's sort of feral. I can pick up his feet and we trim them and stuff, but I don't pick them every day. And so same thing, like when I pick his feet up, I put that in there just because I know I'm not going to be getting them cleaned out. And yeah, I think it's great. I think it's super easy to use. And haven't had thrush, knock on wood.
We'll have to get it. You'll have to send us the information and we'll put it in the show notes if people are people able to purchase it?
Can people buy your product?
Yeah, it's on our website.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's on our website called Pity Putty.
Okay. Pity Putty.
It's basically a clay. I tell my clients it's just medicated mud. Is basically what it is.
It's really clean mud.
Yeah.
So for anybody interested, I'll put a link to it in the show notes when we post the episode. So I think that most horse owners are familiar with thrush. Another hoof-related condition that perhaps isn't thought about as much in the winter is laminitis. Most people think of laminitis in the spring and is typically considered the result of metabolic issues and consuming spring pasture that is high in sugar. My pasture is dead right now. It's been negative 35 here. So my horses aren't getting turned out on it. But what causes laminitis in the winter?
So several factors, I think. It's funny because in my practice, my busiest time with laminitis starts in about August and runs through October. So the fall time and early winter is actually when I see most cases. Some of those are going to be cases that maybe started in the spring and summer and whatever was being utilized for treatment and management wasn't effective enough, and then it gets referred to me usually 1 to 2 shootings later. So I got a number of those that stacks up as well. But in the fall here and in many parts of North America, we get this natural rise of ACTH. So you've got horses that maybe they're not full-blown metabolic Cushing's type cases, except when they start this rise in the fall, they'll start getting a little bit higher in their ACTH. One thing that I see is a layer of many layers of things that stack on top of them. So what happens here in North Texas and probably many other places, but probably specifically here in this part of the world, is where it's still pretty warm in September, and we'll have some heat come in. So there's a layer of heat stress. There's also a lot of shows going on. So then maybe there's been some joint injections on top of that. Plus they're maybe overweight. And then and maybe even subclinically metabolic. Nobody's worried about it. But then we get this natural increase in ACTH coming into the fall as well. And all those things just kind of stack up on top of each other to make that all funnel down to the same problem. Winter specifically, I think that's probably the biggest factor is, I say one of the biggest factors is the natural increase in ACTH that occurs. Then if we're slowing down in our exercise, let's say it's getting colder in the wintertime, we're not exercising quite as much. I think that it's also common for owners to want to feed a lot more in the wintertime. So they're going to say, it's cold, I'm going to throw a little bit more hay. So then they're getting more calories packed on. I think that from a standpoint of just cold, I guess I don't think of winter laminitis as a specific diagnosis. Mainly it's because I live in North Texas and we don't have that much of a winter here. I still see a lot in a lot of laminitis cases in the winter. But more of the winter time potentially is another added stressor that it adds cold stress. Metabolism slows down. Is there potentially insulin that may be more resistant in the cold? Maybe blood supply slows down the feet. So there's lots of factors there that I can stack on top of each other.
I know last fall there was an article or a infographic that went around from one of the universities that after your pasture has 4 frosts on it, you can turn your horses out without their grazing muzzles and not worry about the sugar levels. And I read another article that said, you need to bend the grass down and look at the bottom, because just because the top's been hit by frost, even if it was 4 times, if the bottom of the grass is still green, the sugar's still being produced in that. And I think that a lot of people here, we have lots of pasture, right? I'm in Iowa, I have 40 acres, and people just say, 4 frost, take the muzzles off and throw those horses out. They know the horse is metabolic, but they just think that the frost is enough that it's killed that grass. And I know you're probably not seeing that type of a laminitis in Texas, but it is something that I think is a little bit misleading, that the frost instantly is going to kill that pasture off and the sugar stops. So
yeah, I see that a lot. People really think that especially the cold season species of grasses, the orchards, timothies, brooms, those kinds of things, they will survive the winter. That's what they're cold season grasses. They have coping mechanisms to be able to still be alive the next, all the way through, unlike something like Bermuda, which really does actually die off in the winter. And they get really stressed and become really high in sugar. They look dead. And I've had some classic, cases with owners who I've done nutritional consults for, who, they literally have dead pastures, and they'll tell me there's nothing out there, and then I'll ask them how much hay they're feeding, and they'll say they're not feeding any hay. And their horses are, a body condition score of 5, often sometimes heavier, and look pretty good. And I'm like, well, there's got to be something out there, because you're not providing any other source of roughage. So there has to be some nutritional value to what you're feeding. There's this disconnect that if it's dry, brown, looks dead, that it has 0 nutritional value. And that's not always the case.
I think, too, it's important to note that that when even if that plant became less active because of less photosynthesis and everything somewhat goes dormant, then it's still holding on to a lot of the sugar that it had when it stopped.
Right.
So then it's still going to have that. And then these cooler season grasses are thrive at cooler temperatures, and they stack up sugar a lot more than, say, like our coastal Bermuda grass or native blue stems and things we have down here, where they just are naturally, they don't have to pack in a lot of sugars because of, the sun's going to come up and it's going to be warm again tomorrow. So, and the nights are usually warmer as well. But we get into trouble around here when we have these cool spells in the summertime and it's heavily fertilized, and all of a sudden, it cools down overnight. They're not using all their sugar stores and carb stores up overnight, and then it will pack up.
Right.
And then spring and fall, we have some cool season grasses. For some reason, it's a fad in some areas for them to plant some ryegrass in the fall to have the horses have something to graze on. And that's
we do that in Arizona too, over the top of our Bermuda. Like the Bermuda starts dying off, and people all overseed with rye.
Right. And that's always good for a couple of foundered horses for me a year, seems like.
Yeah, right. So I think I heard you say that winter laminitis isn't really a specific diagnosis. And, I was going to ask you whether there are certain types or breeds or medical histories that are particularly prone to winter laminitis. But I think what I'm hearing you saying is that the horses that often end up getting laminitis or foundering in the winter have perhaps been sort of on the edge for a while. And then it's like everything just compounds and they just happen to sort of tip over, unfortunately, with the sort of added accumulation of things in the winter.
That's the way that I perceive it. Very rarely do I have a case of laminitis and the only thing is that it's wintertime. There's going to be other diagnosable things, Cushing's, metabolic issues. There's other things involved. Very rarely, I can't think of one single case where it was only cold. I've had some cases where maybe there was some frostbite type situations involved that created some laminitis, young foals, things like that were born in cold environments. I think on one particular case that I recall from Alaska, actually, it ended up not so much being laminitis as it was that the foot was so soggy and wet that it got bilaterally lame in the front because it was thin-soled and it was very wet and it was walking on ice and hard ground, and more of a concussion, more of a mechanical traumatic type laminitis and foot pain, not necessarily a true laminitis that led to structural failure of the lamina. I would say I would agree. In my perception is that winter alone in colder temperatures is usually not the only factor.
Okay. I know several years ago, it feels like yesterday, but I'm sure it was actually several years ago, there was some interesting research that was published that horses may handle glucose differently in the winter months than the rest of the year and become more insulin resistant. I think it was around February time the research was looking, but obviously this could be an issue for horses that are already metabolic and have insulin dysregulation. Could you talk a little bit about what the link is between elevated insulin and laminitis? Like, what is it that insulin is doing? At least what's our current understanding of what elevated insulin is doing to the hoof in relation to laminitis?
In my opinion, and from what I've read and learned from, is there's somewhat of a direct effect on the laminar attachment itself. The lamina itself become more stretchy. So it doesn't always result in a complete failure of the lamellar bond, as say when you compare it to a horse that got into the grain or has colitis and a big toxic overload, where those lamina do seem to just break apart. With hyperinsulinemic type laminitis, it seems that they become a little more stretchy over time, and they I think Dr. Paula did some work where they just call it a hypertrophy of the laminar attachments, where they just get longer and longer and longer. They can actually see the cells of the lamina that are elongated. So I think I always think about different types of cases. I would say 90% of the laminitis cases that I see in my practice are some level of metabolic issue, and then another probably 6% are these acute type toxic insults, and then the others are like a support limb type laminitis. So
I think that follows the research pretty closely, doesn't it? I think there's some for field veterinarians, the laminitis cases of the field veterinarians see are pretty much exactly what you just gave as in your own practice, which is interesting.
So the when you always look at how those feet are when I first see them, and if with your colitis or your toxic insult type cases, they'll have an exhibit laminitis pain, like the typical rocking back bilateral lameness that have pulses, but you can x-ray those horses and there will be no bone displacement yet. If you do venograms and you were to do some really small measurements of the lamellar zone, you might pick out that there's some minor changes. But 4 to 6 weeks later, sometimes earlier, is when that lamellar bond begins to break down. And then you see the bony rotation. And that's when a lot of times they'll get really comfortable after the first few weeks and put them on some NSAIDs and ISOM, and they get really comfortable. But then they seem to calmly, they think, oh, they've refoundered 4 to 6 weeks later once that bone displaces and actually causes impingement of that solar choromitis. So in contrast to the metabolic horses, where the first day of pain, you typically x-ray those and there's already bone displacement. And I've had owners tell me, he's like, this is the first day I've ever seen this horse painful, and I've had it its whole life. But you x-ray it and there's already considerable rotation. So those are these type of metabolic horses where the insulin's been a factor and it's created this lamellar bond that's more elastic and stretchy and not as supportive. And when that bone finally started hitting heavily into that solar corium and trapping it and pinching it, that's when they started showing pain. So that's the interesting thing between the two types of cases, is that the insulin is kind of sitting there brewing and creating the problem for quite a while before we actually realize it. Your farriers will oftentimes be able to see that lamina is going to be a little stretched than it normally was, or starting to see some divergent growth rings on the hoof, or different things that say, now that I think back, I remember seeing some stretched lamina the last couple of times.
And the stretched lamina, that's the white line, right? When your farrier is looking at the hoof?
Correct. The terminal lamina would probably be the more accurate term.
Okay.
It gets commonly termed in our industry as the white line, and the white line is actually yellow. And the actual white line of the foot is like the stratum medium, or the an inner layer of the hoof wall itself. So I don't know where the terminology got cross-wired in the historical aspect, but terminal lamina is basically where the lamina has to attach to the lamina of the sole, essentially, and that's what we're looking at.
I have an insulin-resistant pony that I normally exercise 5 or 6 days a week, but like I said, it's been negative 35 here, so I have not been riding at all. And I also feed a lot of hay to help maintain condition. Does this lack of exercise increase his laminitis risk?
Yeah, it sounds like you're setting up for a bomb to go off.
Oh, good. Great.
I think it's important to point out, though, that you are feeding a low-tested and low NSC hay, right? So that helps a lot, because it is an appropriate, less than 10% NSC hay. So that really helps.
I definitely going to be helpful. I think that even horses that are on a low NSC hay, at some point there's still calories involved, and they get fatter and fatter, and that adipose tissue becomes, I think it affects the metabolism more. So then they tend to store that insulin and become more insulin resistant. So then the muscle activity and exercise is a big regulator of that insulin sensitivity and how they regulate their insulin and glucose. So if we, it's been shown where if you can just simply hand walk a horse for 25 minutes a day and encourage the muscle core and stimulate the muscle core, that you'll have a much better insulin regulation. So more hay, more calories, more fat, less exercise. It can definitely increase your odds of having a problem, where you're going to get high insulin potentially over time and create some stretching of that lamina. It's funny because I have to step back and I look at my own world and I see all these metabolic foundered horses, and yet, we can all drive down a road and see all these fat crested neck horses out in a pasture that have never had a problem. And I think there was a study in the UK where they took these 13 fat ponies and found that they ended up finding there is a DNA link to where some of them are going to be more predisposed to having insulin resistance and laminitis versus not. So I think there's got to be something that we don't have figured out yet, and hopefully someday there's going to be a DNA test where we can send it off and say, hey, this pony is going to be at a higher risk because of this genetic component.
Yeah, they've done that in, I wish I could remember what breed it was now. They picked one breed.
It was the Welsh ponies.
I think it was
Welsh
a Welsh
ponies? Yeah, it was Welsh, and they looked at, and they found lines that are prone to insulin dysregulation and laminitis, and ones that aren't, and so they're trying to use that now to try and narrow that down. So we will have the genes, we will know what those genes are later. It's sounding a little bit like, I think there was some research that came across my Facebook feed not that long ago. How about we're all supposed to walk 10 minutes after every meal, and if we all did that, our glucose and insulin would be much, diabetes risk would be much lower than it is just like, to your point, the 25 minutes of hand walking in the arena every day. If you can't do anything else, it's similar in people, we're finding, right? And your risk of developing diabetes goes down with as little as, I think it was 10 minutes of walking after every meal. So it's good for you to walk your horse in hand, Jill. It'll help you as
Either way. Dr. Pittman does know this. I'm texting my vet now. I'm like, get out here and run the insulin. I need a test. I need it done this week. I need to see what the level is.
Meanwhile, we do have an episode on insulin resistance. I think it was episode 21, and another one on PPID. And so if people are want to know more about those, that was episode 8. And then hay testing was episode 19. We've got all sorts of information out there at this point.
Lots of episodes with all the information.
Yes. So obesity, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, if you've got soggy feet, stretching, lamina because the feet are wet, and your horse is fat, that's a recipe just for poor hoof health, regardless of whether it becomes laminitis or not. I mean, you've got all that weight on these, feet that are soggy. I mean, it's sort of a recipe for it, right? I mean,
it's a physics equation. So
exactly, right.
When I have a 1,600-pound halter horse that comes in and they're on a double lot size foot that's 4 inches wide or 3.5, the physics of that is that there's a lot of weight on a small hoof structure. So then each of those lamina are expected to carry a higher pounds per square inch than really what is healthy. I also think that's why some of our ponies and donkeys and things do better, because even though they're small, but their ratio of hoof surface area and laminar surface area to body weight is still better than some of our bigger horses. Things like Norwegian fjords and gypsy vanners, all these horses that are smaller stature but have these big, huge hoof capsules. I love when those walk in the door, because we're going to knock it out of the park, because you just have a lot better success rate when you have that kind of scenario. I can't think of a Norwegian fjord that I haven't lost. I mean, that I have lost. I mean, they just do so much better because of the size of the foot. And same goes with some of those other breeds. So definitely the more weight, it's like any construction engineer that's designing a house or a bridge, whatever, is that it has to be able to carry the amount of weight that it's expected to carry. So then when you add more weight than what it's designed for, you can expect greater failures. Or obviously, if you're weakening the structure with moisture and things like that, then it's not going to be able to carry the same amount of weight.
Yeah, and I'm not a physics person or an engineer. Interestingly, Jill and I are both married to engineers, so that gets covered by my other half. But when we think about this, for those that are not so familiar with the anatomy in the hoof, I think it's worth sharing kind of, you've got the lamina between your hoof wall and your coffin bone, right? Kind of adhering your coffin bone to the hoof wall. But then you've got, is it your deep digital flexor tendon that comes down the back that inserts on the bottom of that coffin bone, right? That's kind of counter pulling against the laminae, which are trying to hold that coffin bone in place. Have I got that right? And so then if your laminae are kind of soggy and stretched and weak and inflamed, they're going to lose the battle against the deep digital flexor tendon that's pulling really quite hard, right, on that coffin bone. And that's kind of what then causes it ultimately to rotate.
It does. So there's this is probably a a whole 3-day lecture we could talk about with the biomechanics
Right.
of that foot. But basically, yes. So you
We'll
have,
save our listeners from all of that. But
I break, I kind of break down the anatomy of the foot. There's our suspension components, which suspension components are going to be the lamina, that's suspending the bone inside the hoof capsule, and then also that deep digital flexor tendon in the back. So if you've got a horse that already has a kind of an upright conformation with a club foot, that tendon's a little bit tighter. So then it's pulling against the lamina a little bit more. So if the lamina fails, then you're more likely to get that rotation. Whereas conversely, when you think about a foot that's a long toe, low heel, that tendon tension is a little bit less. So those horses are more likely to have more sinking than their rotation. So there's less suspension in your lower heel profile feet from that deep digital flexor. So that load is going down more through the bony column and not engaging the deep flexor quite as much, especially when you compare it to, say, a club foot. Then those horses like to have more of a sinking type situation than they do rotate.
yeah. Now we start to understand why it is you have those models, your cadaver models, because those explain all this beautifully. You can really see it. And so that's the value of, a lot of vets have those models. If you're really curious about this, ask them the next time you're in their clinic if they have one, if you want to see it, because it'll really help you kind of understand, the little bit we've just talked about. But I know, we've made references occasionally back and forth between sort of people and horses and what have you. And my dad was pre-diabetic and suffered with some neuropathic pain in his feet, especially when the weather was cold. Is that something that the horses deal with that have, maybe a history of laminitis? Is that affected by the cold weather?
I think the cold weather and the metabolic aspect with the hyperinsulinemic horses, I'm always kind of considering that. I don't know that I can say that it is research proven, but I definitely think it's something to consider. I have cases that are growing sole. They should be happier than they should be because the things that we're monitoring, hoof wall growth and sole growth, should say this horse should be a lot more comfortable than it is. And those are the cases that I start to think about. Well, is there this neuropathic damage or neuropathy that's going on that is making these horses stay colder or stay more painful? And then also wonder about the cold must affect that to some degree as well. I mean, I've got some toes that I had frostbite in Alaska, and it doesn't take much for those to hurt a whole lot. So there's already some pre-existing damage and a little bit of cold, and they start stinging and hurting a little bit. So I can only imagine that it has to be true in horses. There are some medications that I'll start to institute to help with that. One of those is gabapentin. That's one that they commonly use in the human side as well. And then there's a Dr. Frank Riley that has a good protocol for the neuropathic pain that combines a combination of bute and firocoxib or Equiox and gabapentin at a pretty high dose at the beginning, and then you kind of taper it off. And usually if I've got a horse that I'm suspecting that there is some of that neuropathic pain, then I'm going to usually run them through that protocol. And I've been really surprised at how well they do after the fact, especially that case that I can X-ray them and say, you're growing so well. You're responding like I would expect for you to, except for that I would think you should be more comfortable. And that's where I think this neuropathic pain is probably a component there.
I've heard that when horses are in cold weather, they can regulate temperature away from one foot into the other foot when they're standing in the snow. Is that actually true? And if so, does that actually work, or is it a problem?
I tried finding the paper, but Dr. Pollitt and another farrier contact of mine did a study in Alaska not too long after I was there or before I was there. And they confirmed that. They put these thermoprobes in the hoof wall, and they would see that the horse would, as one limb would approach 40 degrees, you would see the blood supply start to kick back over to that foot and raise the temperature, while another foot would start to lower its temperature.
What?
So it is. Yeah, it
I
is.
told you it was
crazy.
So
I didn't believe her.
I tried finding the research paper, and I could not because I was going to send it to you after I read this. But so it is true. How that works, I don't know. I would love to know how, but there's some sort of thermoregulatory system to where they they don't keep all feet the same temperature all the time. You'll see it kind of shift around, and one limb may be rising in temperature while the other one is lowering in temperature. So could it be a problem? I think obviously if it stays too low, that's a big problem. The thermal injury is definitely a problem because the blood supply is going to decrease. We're going to have, insulin glucose metabolism is going to be different. Blood supply is going to be different. Nutrient supply is going to be different. So I think it could be a problem is if it doesn't follow its normal pathway that it's supposed to follow. And maybe, in early in laminitis cases, we're icing them to help decrease inflammatory mediators and improve pain. So there's some benefit from the cold.
Right.
Whether, but too much of a good thing may be bad as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It reminds me of the trees here in Arizona when we don't get any rain, and they will. Jill's like, "What are you going to say?" No, they cut off like a branch, so they'll lose a branch. Like they have an ability to kill a branch to save the whole tree. Like nature's fascinating. Like how does it do this stuff? Right? It blows my mind. I kind of love it, and I also sometimes love the fact that I don't know. You don't know the answer to things and how they work. It just sort of becomes fascinating, right? And your mind's just like, how does that work? So let's say you have a horse that never had laminitis, hasn't been diagnosed with metabolic issues before. What are some warning signs that owners should be keeping their eyes open for that might mean their horse is moving towards a laminitic episode? And I know, you mentioned the hoof temperature. I actually feel my horse's feet. When I pick the hooves up, I really pay attention to the temperature in my hand. And it is fascinating how different they can feel. Like we lost a shoe last week. And when I came back from the Hoof Summit, unfortunately, my farrier hadn't been able to get out there for a few days. By the time I got back 4 days later, that foot was warm. Like he was, it had obviously taken a bit of a bruising from wandering around without a shoe on it for 4 days. And he's an idiot and wouldn't keep what I put on it to protect it on. I have one of those lovely coverings that you can put on to protect a foot. He thought that was great. He just kind of thought that was a toy and got rid of it immediately. But it was fascinating to feel the difference in the temperature in those feet. So what are some things that people can do to kind of be aware of what might be going on in their horse's feet, things they can look for that might be easily missed as warning signs?
So I think obviously any kind of little bit of discomfort. So simply walking across hard ground, maybe coming out of the stall just a little bit stiff. You can also get comfortable with feeling digital pulses. So that's going to be at the in the back of the pastern there. If you feel an increased pulse, obviously a warmer temperature of the feet. You can compare the front to the backs, compare that horse to another horse. That's going to be a big thing as well. I would say the biggest thing that a horse owner should do is monitor their weight. That is the most consistent problem that I see walking into my front door is that they're all overweight, and it's just I'm really hard on my clients when they come in because I want them to remember that. So I have a scale, and everybody has to walk across a scale, and that's the biggest factor involved in all my cases is that the horses are overweight, and that's all human induced for the most part. So, and I see way too much pain and suffering and financial and emotional problems because we've done that. So the biggest thing I can say is I tell people just fill a rib cage every day. If you want to be able to easily fill a rib, you don't want to see it, but you want to easily fill a rib. If you can't do that, then don't love them quite as much and cut some food back. But that's probably the biggest advice I could give to prevent any problems with laminitis.
Right.
But still, yeah, just simple things. I have had cases where they're just a mild lameness that is not easily diagnosed as a laminitis, and they'll go to the veterinarian. It might block out to the foot. It doesn't look like there's any obvious rotation or really major rotational changes. So then next thing you know, they're getting some joint injections or something else that kind of throws some more problems on top of it. And so I would say any kind of mild foot lamenesses, don't completely forget about a laminitic type episode. Get some x-rays, start there.
And there is actually a stall side test now, right? For like insulin. It's not as accurate as doing the the full-blown insulin testing. But I know my vet here, who's a rehabilitation specialist and a surgeon and what have you, he now, before he'll do any joint injections, will try to use those stall side tests to at least just get a picture of the horse's metabolic status in that moment before they do any kind of steroid injections.
I think that's super important. Yep. Yeah. I use the it's the wellness, I think, is the one that I use, and so I use it to monitor from a lot of my horses I'm seeing every 4 to 6 weeks. So those metabolic horses are they at least getting their insulin checked once every 4 to 6 weeks, and that way if we can know what we're doing dietary or medication wise is being effective, and then also as you said before, there's any kind of steroid use or anything. Then finding out where their insulin levels are at. They've shown I think there was a paper presented last year or 2 years ago at AAEP where a single triamcinolone, which is a corticosteroid that's commonly used in joint injections, will increase the insulin for about 72 hours post-joint injection. So if you've got a horse that is, on the borderline metabolic, maybe not full-blown yet, and then you give it a reason to be even higher for a few days while also adding in winter stress, summer stress, work stress, other things, then you potentially set yourself up for a storm.
Yeah, I think there was a paper where if the insulin went over 200 for really a relative short period of, matter of a couple of days, that their insulin risk went up considerably, and that doesn't answer the question of, is the horse that has an insulin of 150, say, for 3 weeks at the same risk? We don't have that research, but certainly those sort of high over 200 insulins, it doesn't take very many hours, to be honest, at that level, whether their laminitis risk goes up. So like as you say, if you've got a horse that's not been diagnosed, right, and they're sort of riding along at that sort of 150, 180, and nobody's realized that, and then they get a steroid injection and that just pumps them up over that threshold, their risk goes up. So it's real.
Yeah, I think also body types and breeds there's some body types and breeds that are worthy of, maybe a few times a year checking some insulin, Arabs and saddlebreds and any horse that's fat or an easy keeper is worthy of checking on that stuff regularly.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just want to add, if you don't know how to check your digital pulse, the next time your vet is out, they will show you. It does take a little bit of practice to be able to find that. But once you've done it a couple times, it's definitely something good to know how to do. And you can check it, every time you pick out your hooves or whatever you want to do. But your vet can certainly help you do that.
Yeah, the pony clubber in me, we're always told as pony clubbers, is like, know what's normal for your horse.
Correct.
Right? And so that's the thing too, is if you never do it and then suddenly you feel it one day and then you're like, is that, is it like that all the time or not? And if you're not familiar with it, it can be a little more alarming than perhaps it should be, or not alarming enough.
Right. I grew up in Canada and I live in Iowa, and I've always lived in northern states. So I'm always had horse keeping experience that involves winter turnout and lots of snow. And anybody that manages horses in the snow knows that snow or ice can ball up in your horse's feet. That obviously makes it really hard for them to walk because they have snowballs stuck on the bottom of the feet. I use Crisco. I found that it works the best, and I just keep it in my barn and I slather it into the bottom of their feet before I turn them out. Is that those snowballs or that ice ball something to be concerned about? And is Crisco the right choice, or is there something else I should be using?
So I think anything that's sticky can help prevent that. Pam cooking spray, I've heard people do. You just have to reapply things like that so often. The actual balling up of the snow can create some direct load and trauma for the sole. So if the horse has plenty of foot, let's say your horse has 15, 20 millimeters of sole depth, it's a nice sturdy wall. The fact that some snow balls up in there and causes some direct load to the sole probably isn't as likely of a problem. But if you've got a thin-soled thoroughbred that has 5 to 6 millimeters of sole, then yeah, if he runs around on a hard-packed ice ball on his foot, then he's going to get potentially foot sore just from that direct physical trauma. Second component to consider is that it's going to change some of the biomechanics of how that foot is working in the snow. So you'll see some of them as they trot up, they're sitting on that ball of snow and then kind of rocking back on it and increasing the load on those flexor tendons and hyperextending that coffin joint. So there becomes some biomechanical properties too that can be a problem. I think that the things on a barefoot scenario to keep the snowballs from in there can be difficult because of you got to reapply them. But the good thing about a lot of barefoot horses is that they'll get some snowballs. Usually they're coming out a lot more regular than say if you've got a horse that's with a normal shoe on that can kind of trap and hold that and lodge that snowball in there. Whereas, typically in the wintertime, if you're in those snowy environments, then your farriers are going to be using some snow pads to help pop that snowball out of there. So the little snowball pads or the little snow rim pads that they can put in there are going to help that from accumulating.
And what about hoof dressings and sealants? I don't use anything on my horse's feet in the winter. I have the clay that I put in, but is that something that people should be using? I mean, there's certainly lots of products on the market that are for wet conditions for hooves. Do you recommend putting something on them?
I do. I'm a big fan of Keratex hoof hardener, or there's a new one out called Kera Prep, and they're both similar formulations. So that formulation specifically is really the only thing that can modify the current hoof structure. A lot of the things that we either feed or put on is going to modify and improve the new hoof wall going down. But I think it's the formaldehyde in the formula that's in that Kera Prep hoof hardener that increases the sulfur links between the tubules and makes that wall more hydrophobic. So it's going to shell, it's going to dry, it's going to push the water out. It's going to make it more water resistant. And you can take a soft, flexible hoof in a matter of 4 to 5 days of putting that on there once a day. It'll be much, much tougher. So I in the wet times of probably the biggest time that we struggle around here is spring and fall. We go through these really intense periods of a lot of moisture and feet get really soft and flexible. So I send home bottles of Kera Prep partner for the clients to put on those feet every day for a week and then a couple times a week after that. And so in your wintertime when it's wet and snowy and they're just standing around, I would say yes, a couple times a week at least. Put that on a nice, dry, clean foot. You'll want to stay about 3/4 of an inch below the coronary band because it is something that if you get on the coronary band itself or your epidermis, then it's going to harden and toughen that as well. And we don't necessarily want that. But you can really save some lameness, save some problems by using that on the wall and the sole as well. I'll usually not put it on the frog as often. You can occasionally put it on the frog, but it does penetrate into that horn and have its effect. So if you have a real thin frog and it penetrates in there, then you could potentially penetrate deep enough where it causes some inflammation of that corium underneath the frog. But
wow, sounds like powerful stuff.
Kera Prep is that Kera Prep and that formulation is a definitely magic on a wet hoof.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And so for our listeners again who maybe not clear, like coronary band is kind of like your cuticle on the horse's hoof. It's kind of the hairline at the top of the hoof that the hoof grows out of. So you're saying we shouldn't be putting this product near that.
Correct. About 3/4 of an inch below that. So that we want the moisture content in the upper wall needs to have a certain amount of moisture to have that flexible nature. But the lower part, especially what they're bearing weight on, we don't want it to be quite as bendable and flexible.
That makes sense. So I have to ask, because I live in Arizona and have the completely opposite issue, like for people that are in like super dry climates and probably like you in the summer where it's probably very dry there in Texas, do we not have to worry so much? I mean, is it there's the opposite products that say that they add moisture. They're not so much sealants, right? They're adding moisture. Something not worth worrying about. I feel like what I'm hearing is that horses in dry climates are perhaps a little better off as far as their hoof health potentially.
I would much rather have a hard dry hoof than a wet hoof any day. I have run across cases where it is it's too dry and hard, so it can get brittle. And then even here where the feet will tend to contract a little bit when it gets dry, because that, just like if your farrier's done and he nips off a round of hoof wall and you throw it on the ground, you look at it just in a few hours as it starts to dehydrate and doesn't have that hoof to hold it apart, it starts curling up on itself. So I think that in the old farriers and maybe even current farriers, especially in dry environments, they would say, just let your water tank overflow and let them stand in the mud a little bit. The week before
exactly. I had a Mustang, but that's exactly what my farrier said years ago. After a couple of shoeings, he was a young kid. He was just come out of farrier school, was apprenticing with my farrier, and because he was barefoot, my farrier didn't want to do him, so the apprentice got him. He was a good guy. He did a good job. But after a couple of times, he's like, "Can you please empty your water trough for 36 hours before I come out? I am going through hoof knives like crazy on this. I'm dying here trying to get the hoof wall off this horse."
So I think, water obviously is going to be an effective tool to soften it. I think some of the products that are out there are a lot of oil-based and petroleum-based to try to add some moisture to the foot. There's one that I've been using here lately, and we don't get, in the summertime here around July and August, it can get pretty dry. There's one called Hydra Hoof. It doesn't make the hoof all greasy and nasty. And from a farrier standpoint that's picking up feet every day, I like that one better because it's not, when I go to pick up the foot, it's not all slimy and greasy. So Hydra Hoof or Hydro Hoof, something along that line is a good one to put on that hoof wall to help in the really dry times.
Nice. Well, I'll keep an eye open for that one. So I moved my horses last year from a situation where they were in very large stalls, 24/7 with very limited turnout opportunity, to a situation where they now get to be turned out for probably 10 hours a day. And my thoroughbred had a noticeable increase in the amount of hoof growth. Just nothing else changed other than, its turnout ability. And I've heard that movement's important for hoof growth, and that's part of it. You've got diet and movement and things, but it was really interesting to actually see that firsthand, if that's in fact what I was seeing. But it made me think about, horses in winter that, like Jill's horses aren't getting to move as much right now because it's so cold and snowy and things outside, and they're being shut in more. Do we see that impacting horses' feet, the decrease in movement in the winter with lack of exercise?
I think we must consider that movement has something to do with it. A lot of the blood supply in the foot is largely mechanically and hydraulically induced. So if they're just standing in one spot more, then the foot isn't really pushing the blood supply around like it should. Yes, the heart pump is a big component, but yet the movement of the horse is what actually pushes a lot of the venous supply and allows the arterial supply to come in. So movement is definitely crucial. I think wintertime horses that don't grow as fast, we also have to consider that they're burning a lot of energy trying to stay warm, and they're growing hair more than anything. That's so true. I think we see a lot of shift in. We see shift here in the fall, wintertime where they don't grow near as much as they do, but yeah, if you look at them, they've got twice as much hair. So I think there's that component that there's a little bit of shift, and that kind of comes with, I think, that natural fall rise in ACTH and cortisol is what helps stimulate that body to become winterized. And I always see those feet grow less during that time. So I think there's something to say about that as well. But movement is crucial for a horse in lots of ways. They've shown time and time again where we used to stick tendon injuries and lamenesses in just in a stall for 6 months. And now they're showing, an active rehab is much better in all cases because they're just designed to heal on the move better. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, now that keratin, instead of coming out on their hooves, is coming out on their hair. I'll remember that the next time we're growing. It's a relocation of keratin. It's being used for something else. That's the protein in their feet and in their hair.
I know another common practice in the winter in all these cold environments is to pull the shoes. I have barefoot ponies, so I'm on a 4-week trim schedule. We go to 6 weeks in the winter, but my farrier has a lot more availability in the winter because he said most people pull their shoes in November and he doesn't see those horses again until March when they're ready to tack the shoes back on. Is that a common practice, and is that a good practice?
I would say it's not uncommon in the northern areas because the feet just will quit growing. I know when I was in Alaska, I would have some cases go 10, 12 weeks before they would even look like they needed trim. So they're going to slow down a bunch in growth. Is it a good practice? I think it's going to come down to the horse and the quality of foot that they have to begin with. So some horses that have shelly feet, or maybe there's other underlying pathologies that the mechanics of the shoe is providing a positive environment for them, then I don't think pulling the shoes on those for the winter is a good idea. But if you have a sound horse that doesn't really need the extra wear protection of a shoe, and you're not going to be riding a whole lot, and the foot doesn't fall apart when you pull the shoes off, then I don't think that's a bad idea. They're going to grow slower. If you're not doing a whole lot, then I don't see that as being potentially harmful. So it kind of boils down to the individual horse and what their specific requirements are.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because, my thoroughbred actually has really hard feet and nice feet. People always say thoroughbreds don't have great feet, but he's actually got really pretty decent feet just when you first look at them from a hardness standpoint. And you would think, I've had people sort of say, he could go barefoot. Clearly, when he pulled a shoe off last week, it became very evident he's not a candidate for being barefoot. He thought he was going to die without a shoe on that foot. But interestingly, we had shoeing x-rays done on him in September, and he's very slightly flat-footed. His coffin bone angles are a little too flat. So I wonder whether if people are thinking of pulling shoes, if it's actually worth taking those x-rays, because, I'm wondering whether him being a little flat-footed, he actually doesn't quite have he actually likes having shoes on, and whether that plays a role. But I mean, would you recommend doing shoeing x-rays so you know what's going on in the foot before you take the shoes off?
Since I take,
so you know how much sole you've got, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have the benefit of taking lots of x-rays of all my foot cases, and the benefits and the information gained from those are invaluable. So if you've got a horse that you're considered taking barefoot and you take the x-rays and you've only got, say, 7 to 10 millimeters of sole, maybe the angles aren't just right, then it's going to be tough for that horse to be comfortable without some form of protection, artificial protection. So, then if you still are, I have seen horses' quality of foot and quality of heel structure and angles improve while barefoot and out of work, but yet they also have to have a certain amount of protection. So if they don't have the sole depth, then you're looking at still providing some level of artificial protection in a boot or, soft environment, something. So I think the x-ray definitely has the benefit of giving you some information to help you make some better judgment calls. I've seen horses that kind of fall into this. The owner now is got this friend that's a barefoot trimmer, and no horses have to have shoes, and everything can be lived barefoot, and you can fix anything barefoot. And they go through this cycle of where they're very painful and they just really never get over the hump. So not that I'm against shoes or against barefoot. It's just that for every horse, there's a very specific and individual approach for that specific horse. I see some horses that, I take them barefoot and they do better. And that's my treatment approach. Yeah. And I've got others that I'll never be able to pull out of shoes because there's underlying pathology that just won't allow it.
Yeah, I have one of each. And I think that's, I think we've said this before in other episodes, but it's always a dangerous thing in horses to use the word, always or never, right? To become so fixated on an approach that it always has to be that way or it never should be that way. Because when you take that philosophy, there's going to be a horse somewhere that you do a disservice to by kind of having that rigid thinking. So there's something out there for every horse.
Yeah, you leave it to a horse to serve you up a big old piece of humble pie. The minute you think you have it figured out, then you're about to learn a new lesson.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any, because I've got one of each, are there any differences in, winter hoof care between a shod horse and a barefoot horse that you could think of, or not really? The hoof's a hoof and treat it the same way?
Not really. I think your rate of growth slows down, at least in the colder climates. Probably for you in Arizona, it may not change a whole lot, but I think that shod versus barefoot, to me, it kind of comes back to the individual hoof and what that specific hoof needs. That's where your farrier and your veterinarian, they're going to have, some input on whether that's going to need to be different or not through the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've certainly covered some great information about winter hoof care and then some. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you're like, oh, I wish I'd said that, or just burning thing you'd like to share that we didn't get to?
Just repeat myself at keep your horses thin. Or appropriate
Yes.
weight. How about that?
I think, I feel like winter is such a great tool for allowing that to happen, and we don't let it, right? So horses go through ebbs and flows in their condition, and winter is a time when horses naturally in their, natural setting would lose condition, and then as the grass comes in the spring, they put it back on again. We're not very good at letting horses do that. And then you do a cycle of that for 3 or 4 years, and suddenly you've not even realized what's standing in front of you, and you've got this obese horse, right? So if you've got a heavy horse, use winter to your advantage. Let it burn some calories to kind of keep warm and hopefully lose a little condition and get down to that 5.
And if you don't know how to check the condition of your horse, episode 38 is on body condition scoring, and episode 39 is how to use those body condition scores to calculate if what you are feeding is appropriate. Thank you so much for coming on our show and being our guest today. We really appreciate your time. I know you had a long day. We're recording this at 7:00 for you, and you've already done how many cases? I don't even know. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
To find out more about Dr. Pittman, you can visit his website. There's also a lot of great information and videos on there. You can find him on Facebook. I'll put a link to both in the show notes, and I'll tag him on social media. For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com, and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at ClarityEquine.com.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd share it with your friends on social media. Give it a like and subscribe on all your favorite podcast platforms. That means a lot to us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.